Hi and welcome to this beginner's Photoshop course. This course has a huge amount of information in it in such a short space of time that I don't expect you to remember everything. And it usually takes a few months to get comfortable with Photoshop, to understand its logic and how to use it in your workflow. So don't feel like you need to learn everything in a day or even in a week or even in a couple of weeks. If it takes a while to get the hang of it, that's okay. It took me a few months to really get used to it. So don't be harsh on yourself and don't be self-critical. You'll get there in the end. But feel free to watch this video course over and over again and practice on your own photos. Now, let's begin the tutorial. The first thing we want to do is set up our workspace. And by that, I mean we basically affect the layout so that it's optimal for photographers. And in the top right-hand corner, you might have something here which says Essentials or some other drop-down box, but I have this thing here and you can see we have a list of options. Now if you don't see that, instead you can click on Window, Workspace, and then you see we have Essentials, 3D, Graphic and Web. We want to select Photography, so make sure you do that, and once you do, you'll notice you have a layout similar to mine. You might see that the histogram is actually above my adjustments panel. And you can move your panels any way you want. And when you see these blue lines, that means you can let go of the panel and just place the panel where those blue lines are. Or you can even put them in this little bar here. So now we have our adjustments here if you want to save space. So I'm just going to put that back to where it was. The next thing we're going to look at is bit depth and color space. By bit depth, we're basically just looking at how much information our photos have. And there are two main options, but to bring this up, we first have to open up an image in Photoshop. And to open up an image, we can just go to File, and we can go to Open, and then select our image, or we can go to a folder where our image is, select the image, and just drag it into Photoshop. And it'll open up like that. Now, when we go to Image and Mode, we can see at the bottom we have 8-bit, 16-bit and 32-bit. Now the two primary editing modes are 8-bit and 16-bit. And don't worry if you feel like this is a little bit complicated, I'm going to keep it really simple. This is what it means. 8-bit means your image has a little bit less information. That's all. 16-bit means your image has more information. This means when you edit in 16 bits, you're more likely to come out with a slightly cleaner image. And by slightly, I mean really small differences. This is especially useful when you have banding in your sky. And if you don't know what banding is, let me show you. I'm going to open up this image I've already prepared. And if we zoom into this image, we can see we have all these lines where the colors are broken up in kind of a negative way. And we can often see this in blue skies when we're editing photos. The sky will become broken up like this. And this is what we call banding. Now, if I just undo this layer that I did before, this is what it should be like. You see, we have this smooth transition between colors, and this is banding. Now we notice that we're editing in 8 bits here. So that's sometimes what happens when we edit in 8-bit. To avoid that, if we edit in 16-bit, we usually come up with a much cleaner transition between tones. Now, the truth is, most of the time you can edit in 8-bit. It really doesn't make a big difference for our type of photography. However, I edit in 16-bit because my computer has some pretty high specs, so it can deal with the extra workload. But if you've got a smaller computer or a slower computer, there's nothing wrong with editing most of your images in 8-bit. So all we need to do to change the bit depth of our image is click on 8 or click on 16, whichever we want. But we can decide if we want to open up our images automatically in 8-bit or 6-bit. And this applies to raw files. So I'm going to show you how to set this up. Please find one of your raw files from any image, it doesn't really matter, and drag it into Photoshop just like I showed you. And come back to this video when you've done that. So I'm going to take my raw file. Let's just take this one that I've got here, shot from my Nikon. And you'll see when we drag our image into Photoshop or load our image into Photoshop, and if it's a RAW file, we'll open Adobe Camera Raw. And this is exactly the same as Lightroom, just without the organizational module. Now, we don't want to do anything here. All we want to do is go down to the bottom where it says Adobe RGB 16-bit, and you see the other numbers along here too. We just want to click on that. And here, we can set our color space and our bit depth. So this is what we were talking about earlier. And if you want to work permanently in 16 bits, then I would choose 16 bits, or you can choose 8 bits, whatever's right for you. The next thing I would suggest is that you change your color space to Adobe RGB. This will just give you a richer range of colors to work with than if you edited in the normal default sRGB mode, which stands for standard RGB. So I would change those two things and I wouldn't do anything else. I'd just press OK. Now when you're finished with that, press open and your image will open, and then you can just close it, and that should save the settings that you've just used. So now we've set up our workspace and we know how to open images. I'm going to show you how to save images. If we just go to File and Save or Save As, that'll allow us to save our images any way we like. But if we want to save for the web, instead we should go to Export and Export As. And because we chose the Adobe RGB color space, that's not optimal for the web. So when we choose Export As and we choose JPEG, it gives us this option to convert to sRGB, which is optimal for the web. So you can change the size of your image. Let's say I'm going to go for 1000 pixels wide. And then once I'm happy, I can just press Export All. And then we'll have an image ready for the web. So all of that's pretty straightforward. Let's now talk about the toolbar on the left here. We have all these different options, and these are the different tools available to us in Photoshop. Now, when we have an image like this, we can't really edit it until we unlock this layer. So if you see a lock on your background layer, if you're in CC, you just press it once. If you're using CS6, you have to double click. So I'm going to press it once and then we've unlocked the layer. Now we can edit this layer. So let's look at these toolbars. If you see a little arrow at the corner of your tool, then that means you can right click and you have multiple options. So if you right click on the rectangular marquee tool, you'll see we have an elliptical marquee tool just below it. And if we right click on our paintbrush, you'll see we have a pencil tool. So we have multiple options along the toolbar. And let's start with the most useful. So this in the top left-hand corner is called the Move tool. If we click on our image, we can drag it around and place it in all different areas. And that's going to be very useful when it comes to stacking exposures in the Art of Photography course. The next few tools are selection tools. So they allow us to make a selection. So for example, if I choose the rectangular marquee tool, I can do this along here and we've made a selection. Whenever you see these things, we call them marching ants. And they show us what's selected in our photo. So if I right click on that selection and choose layer via copy, I'm going to make this layer, the big image here, invisible. And you see we've now made a copy of that area. And we can move it about if we select the Move tool. So I'm just going to make the background layer visible again. And there you go, we can move this anywhere we want. With the other tools, we have here the lasso tool, which gives us free rein to make any selection we like. Or we can select the polygonal lasso tool, which allows us to make points like this, straight points, and connect them. And now if you want to deselect your active selection, we can just go to Select and Deselect. Or we can press Command and D or Control and D on a PC. And we deselect the selection there. Below this tool, we have the Magic Wand tool. And the Magic Wand tool basically makes a selection for us. So if we just click on the image, the Magic Wand has made a selection based on what we clicked on. And an even better tool than that, if you right click on the Magic Wand tool, you'll come up with the Quick Selection tool. And here we can make a selection by drawing along the object we want to select on our image. And you'll see the Quick Select tool does a pretty good job of making the selection. So we're just selecting this mountain along here. Now when we have a selection, we can always add an adjustment. And we're going to talk more about adjustment layers in the next video. But let me just open up, let's say, a levels layer. This is a contrast adjustment layer. And you can see we can make adjustments to that selection. And it's only affecting the selection that we made. Now with all of the selections, we have the ability to change some of the settings. So you'll see above here, we have some options. And when we change the tool that we're working with, those options change. So let's say we've got the lasso tool, for example. If we set a feather, feather basically means how soft we want our edges to be. So let's say we go for a higher feather. And by the way, when we have options like this, we don't have to click on the number and manually input the number we want. We can just click on the word, and this is called scrubby slider, and we can move it left or right. So let's say we want a really large feather of, I don't know, let's say 80. Then if we make the selection, it makes a selection here, and if I right click just as we did before and do layer via copy, and then I make the background layer invisible, you can see we have some really soft edging now around that selection, whereas before we had a square selection or a rectangle selection, and that had solid edges. So on all of the tools, not just the selection tools, we have the ability to refine the tool and give ourselves greater flexibility with how we use the tools. I should say around about now that your tools might be in a different order to mine. And if that is the case, it's okay. You can just look for the ones that look slightly similar. And your tools might look a little bit different, because when I have, let's say, the Magic Wand tool selected, that's the thing that we can see on the toolbar. And if I right click and choose the quick selection tool, that's what I can see. So yours might not look identical to this, so you might need to take a moment or two just to locate the exact tool that I'm working with. But don't worry, you can always pause the video and then come back to it. The next tool is the crop tool, and I'm sure you already know how to use the crop tool. All we need to do is select the tool, click on the image, and then we can bring in the crop tool and just decide how we want to crop the image. Up here we have delete cropped pixels, and that means if we crop the image and press OK, then whatever's outside of this image will be permanently deleted. But if you don't want that, because maybe you want to go back and make changes and you don't want to lose this information, then keep this unchecked. And using the crop tool is actually how we often straighten our images in Photoshop. And I think it's very similar to the one in Lightroom. All we do is choose this straighten function here, and we choose somewhere on the horizon that we want as our straight edge. Now we don't actually have an horizon here, but I'm going to make it a little bit crazy just to show you how Photoshop straightens, or in this case doesn't straighten the image. So there you go. Photoshop has straightened itself according to the line that I just drew. And if you want to keep the changes, you can press the tick button, or if you can cancel by pressing the cancel button, or you can undo your changes by pressing this button here. Now I'm going to continue down and just talk about some of the more important tools that we use as landscape, cityscape photographers. So here's another one, which is the Eyedropper tool, and this lets us choose any color in our image and set it as our foreground color. Now this is our foreground color here, and this is our background color here, and we'll look more at that later. But our foreground color here is blue. Now if I click on this mountain, you'll see it changes to a slight pink because the mountain's pink. Or if I click on the moon, it'll turn white because the moon's white. And this can be extremely useful when you want to pinpoint particular colors, especially when we dodge and burn colors. Now the next three options are designed to help us clean our image. So if we had some sensor dirt or some problems in the scene that we need to clean up, then these will help us do that. So on our image, let's say we want to get rid of the moon. We can choose this tool, which is called the patch tool. And all we do is draw around the area that we want to get rid of. Then we have this selection here, and we can drag it right or left and replace it with a different part of the sky. And Photoshop does its best to equalize the color so it looks like a natural transition. But in this case, it didn't do a great job because you can see some lines around the moon. So I'm just going to undo all of this. So to undo something, we go to Edit, Step Backward, and we can do that a few times. And this will undo our changes that we made. And there's the moon. Next, we have the Healing Brush tool. So if we select that, here we're going to clone an area and swap it with another area. So I want to change the size of this brush. This is kind of like a brush here. And this little circle around it represents how large it is. So I can go to this option here and increase the size of that brush to 267. Now, I need to clone an area, let's say to the right, and replace this area here with that cloned area. To clone, all I do is hold down Alt on a PC or Option on a Mac, and then left click on the area I want to clone it with. And when I do that, I can now take it over to the moon and just paint in that area. And you see, Photoshop has replaced the moon with this area, and it's trying its best again to adjust the brightness and colors so it looks like a natural blend. But it doesn't look very natural here again because it's kind of a difficult thing to remove. I'm going to undo all this again, and this time go down here to the clone stamp. You might see the pattern stamp, but we're going to go to the clone stamp tool. And the clone stamp literally replaces one area with another. So again, I'm going to change the size of this brush, let's say with 220. And it's not quite as useful for cleaning up images as the other tools because it doesn't try to automatically change the brightness of the area we're cloning. Watch what happens. It just does a literal clone. So I'm going to press Alt or Option on a Mac, and left click on the area I want to clone, and then I'm going to clone over the moon. Now this has actually done quite a good job because the sky is quite consistent in terms of brightness. But if I clone, let's say somewhere down here, and then try to clone the moon, you see it clones it exactly, the same brightness and color and everything, so it looks quite unnatural. I would say I use the clone stamp more than any other stamp, and that's because we can use a non-destructive blank layer to do that. And we're going to get into what non-destructive means in Photoshop in the next video. But for now, just keep in mind that the clone stamp gives us more flexibility and more options to work with when we're removing things in our image or when we're duplicating areas. Next, let's go to the brush tool. Now the paintbrush tool, you might see the pencil tool. The paintbrush tool is probably the most used tool in Photoshop for landscape photographers, cityscape photographers. In fact, it's probably used for every single user of Photoshop. It's probably the most used tool. And that's because of something called masking. And I'm going to get more into masking in the next video because it's slightly more advanced, but still a very basic concept. But essentially, a paintbrush tool is exactly that. It's a brush, and we can just paint on our image, and whatever our foreground color is, that's what we'll paint. So if we want to change our foreground color, we can just click on this white bit here where our foreground is, and we can choose any color. And if you want to change the range of colors, we can just slide this up here and then select anywhere in this palette and press OK. So here I am just painting in on the photo. Now I can change my brush size up here to a smaller brush size or a larger brush size, and hardness. So when we paint, you see we have some soft edges, just like the feathering when we made the selection earlier. Well, hardness makes us have hard edges. So if we go for a hardness of 100%, you see we have a harsh edge. Now, in terms of our style of editing, I almost exclusively use a hardness of 0%. So we want it to be a really smooth, soft transition between areas, just like this here. Now flow is where, let's say we put it at 50%. This is where we paint on an area like this. You see it's quite subtle, it's not as full as this area. And then we paint on it again. We are strengthening the effect here. But I'm just going to undo all of this. If we change flow to 100% and paint, you see we have that thick paint along here just like that. And for example, when we bring that back down to around 50% again, what happens is if we paint over what we've just done, you see we're painting over it and we're thickening and strengthening the effect. But if we go to something like opacity, so let's bring our flow up to 100%. And for landscape and cityscape photography, I always use a 100% flow. But let me show you what the difference between opacity and flow is. Well, if I bring opacity down to 50%, you'll see, again, we still have some of that background in there. It's not like a thick block of color. And if we paint over it without taking our left finger off the mouse, so it's just one smooth movement, it doesn't thicken, it doesn't get stronger. But if we go to flow and we change flow to, let's say, 50%, watch what happens. I'm keeping my left mouse button on, and you see each time it's getting thicker and thicker all the time. So the difference between flow and opacity is that opacity basically just lowers the visibility of the paintbrush. So at 50%, that's what we'll see. And at 100%, we'll paint the full amount on our image. But with flow, at 100%, watch, if we go over it, nothing really happens. We can go over it a few times and it's still the full thickness of the paint. But if we reduce flow down to 50%, we can still see the background. It's not completely red. But if we go over the same area over and over again, we eventually see nothing but the paint. So again, I always put flow at 100%, especially for luminosity masking. This helps to avoid halos and edging. Now, if you want to zoom into an area on your image, we can use this magnifying tool and we can just click on the image and drag right, which zooms in, or drag left to zoom out. Alternatively, we can zoom into 100% like that, or we can press fit screen, just get it back to normal. If you want shortcuts for that, if you hold down Control and 1 or Command and 1, you zoom in 100%. If you hold down Control and 0 or Command and 0 on a Mac, you fit screen. And finally, I'm just going to show you one more thing. Here we have the paint bucket tool. You might see the gradient tool, but this is the paint bucket tool here. And essentially with a paint bucket tool, let me just create a brand new layer, and we create new layers with this little icon here. And you'll see it's an empty layer. It's a blank layer. And now watch what happens if I use the paintbrush tool. We paint it all red, the same color we were painting in before, because that's our foreground color. And this can come in useful for general photo editing once you're a bit more advanced in Photoshop. So I'm going to delete this layer. Now, to delete a layer, we can right click on the layer and choose delete layer, or we can have the layer selected and just press the trash can, or we can drag the layer down to the trash can. Now let's have a look at our workspace a little bit more. You'll see on my workspace I have these measurements along here and down the side as well. Now watch what happens when I click on this area and then drag right. I pull out a ruler so I can see if I have any straight lines or crooked lines in my image. And it's always better to use the Move tool when working with rulers, because then you can just select the ruler, and when you want to get rid of it, you can just drag it off the image. Now, if you don't see the rulers, all you need to do is go to View and then Rulers. And if I click that, you see my rulers disappear. But if we press it again, you'll make the rulers active. And I like to keep these on here because I want to make sure my horizon's straight, or if I have any other buildings that I don't want to be crooked, then I bring this along and just use it to measure the straightness of that object. Now I'm just going to open up another image in Photoshop, and I can drag it again if I want. Let's say I open up this image and bring it over Photoshop. Now I can drag it right on top of this image, and that means this photo will open up on top of that one. And on the right hand side, you see we have two layers now. Now I'm going to delete that because I want to open that photo instead in a different window. And we can do that by just dragging and dropping the image in this gap here above the photo and to the right of the photo's name. And when we do that, it opens up in a separate window. So this is what we have along here. These are our windows. This is our nighttime image, and this is our library image. And to close the window, we simply press this X icon. Now I want to talk to you a little bit about the logic of Photoshop. And essentially Photoshop is made so that we can create what's known as a non-destructive workflow. And that means we can make as many changes as we want, and we can still go back at any point down the line and undo those changes. So let's say we're editing a photo and we realize that we've made a mistake maybe 10 steps before. Maybe we've added too much color to an area, or we've sharpened an area too much. Well, instead of undoing everything that we've done, all we can do is just go down to a particular layer, just make some little changes to that layer, and that'll affect the whole image. So it's called non-destructive because essentially we can make changes that don't ruin the entire image. And we don't have to more or less start from scratch every time we want to make a change. So when people talk about layers, we have what's known here as a layers panel. And this is where all of our layers live. Now you don't have to worry about this, but I'm going to create some adjustment layers. And you'll see we're creating these layers here. And this is our background layer, this thing down here. This is our bottom layer. Now layers are kind of like the layers of a cake. Whatever's at the bottom you usually don't see, and whatever's on top you do see. So let's again open up that image like we did before and press OK. And you can see that this library image is on top of our moonlit image. And so because of that, that's what we see. That's the main image on our screen. So whatever's on top affects the things below it. Now, let me give you another example of that. I'm going to open up, let's say I'm going to click on this top layer and press hue saturation. The reason why I clicked on this layer is because I wanted this hue saturation layer to be on the top. If I click on, let's say, a curves layer, and you don't need to worry about any of these layers now, and then create a hue saturation layer, you'll see that has opened up just above the curves layer. So whatever we've selected, whatever layer that we're on, that's whatever new layer we're creating will be above. So I'm going to press the vibrance layer and just create a hue saturation layer. So this is at the top of the layer, and when I bring down the saturation, you see we're desaturating this exposure. But watch what happens if I drag this hue saturation layer below the library layer. So now it's below it. You see, it isn't desaturating the library layer anymore. It's not affecting it. It's only affecting the layers below. Now you see these eye icons? These make layers visible or invisible. So if I press this eye icon next to the library image, watch what happens. The library image becomes invisible. And now if I press this eye icon on my hue saturation layer, you can see the effect the hue saturation layer is having on the moonlit image. So this eye toggles whether or not something is affecting the whole image, whether or not it's visible. And to get even more control over our workflow, if we want to close any of these dialogues that pop up, we can just press this arrow button. And now when you've selected a layer, you can go up to what's known as opacity. And that's just the same as a brush opacity, for example. We're basically making this layer partially visible. So when we press the I button, we're giving the layer 0 opacity. And that's what happens when we have 0 opacity. The hue saturation layer is invisible now, and it's not affecting the image below. But if we bring the opacity up, let's say 20%, 25%, we've now reduced some of that saturation. We have basically 25 or 26% in this case effect from this layer. And now if we bring it up to 50%, you see we're getting a stronger effect. And again, if we go up to 100%, we now completely desaturate the layer because we're making this hue saturation layer completely visible. This setup by Photoshop, having these layers here and being able to change the order of the layer, the opacity of the layer, the visibility of the layer, gives us huge control over our post-processing. And combined with masks, which we'll look at later, we can essentially make a huge workflow, a massive photography workflow, and go back to any point in that workflow and make fine changes. And that's why, or one of the reasons why Photoshop is more superior to Lightroom. Lightroom's non-destructive. If we move a slider along, we can of course go back at any time and move that slider back. But in Photoshop, when we combine it with the selection tools and masking, we give ourselves so much more control over our photos. So that's it for part 1 in this beginner's tutorial. There's a lot to take in, especially if you're brand new to Photoshop, so please feel free to watch this a couple of times and experiment with your images in Photoshop. And in the next video, we're going to take things a little bit further and a bit more advanced, but it's still very easy to understand. Don't feel apprehensive, feel relaxed, and I promise it'll come to you with a little bit of practice.